Ethan Pierce had served as Chief Risk Officer at Apex Capital for 12 years. He was the seventh employee. Back when Harold Bennett sketched Apex's original blueprint in a cramped, drafty apartment in San Francisco's Soma district, Ethan had sat on a wobbly metal folding chair, hunched over a beat-up second-hand laptop, building Apex's very first risk assessment model line by line. The heat had been broken that winter, and they'd kept their coats on while they worked, drinking burnt coffee from a dented pot and arguing into the small hours about default probabilities and correlation matrices. The walls had been thin enough that they could hear the neighbor's television through the drywall, and the only window faced a brick wall 3 feet away. Back then, Apex was nothing more than an idea scrawled on a whiteboard in blue dry erase marker, but Harold had spoken about it like it was already a skyscraper piercing the Manhattan skyline. He'd said they would build something that lasted, something that didn't cut corners, something that people could trust. Ethan had believed every word. He'd had good reason to believe it. In those early years, Harold had walked the walk. He'd turned down easy money from questionable clients. He'd killed deals that looked profitable on paper, but carried hidden risks that didn't sit right with him. During the 2008 financial crash, when every other firm on the street was leveraged to the hilt and scrambling for cash, Harold had sat in that same tiny apartment with Ethan for 3 straight days, drinking bad coffee and unwinding every position. One by one, even when it meant taking short-term losses that made their investors yell. Surviving is winning, Harold had said at 4 a.m, rubbing bloodshot eyes, as the markets melted down on the screen in front of them. If we're still standing when the dust settles, we win. They had stood. And they had won. That was the moment Ethan decided he would follow this man anywhere. 12 years later, Ethan had led his team to build the Libra Risk platform, an industry benchmark recognized across Wall Street as the gold standard for institutional risk management. Through 3 major market crises, the 2015 commodity crash, the 2018 volatility event, the 2020 liquidity freeze, it had shielded Apex from more than $20 billion in potential losses. A saying circulated among analysts and traders alike, passed around conference rooms and trading floors: Apex had 2 moats. One was Harold Bennett's eye for opportunity. The other was Ethan Pierce's Iron Gate. Harold himself had said it countless times on stage, at investor conferences, in magazine profiles and television interviews. Ethan is the person I trust most in this world. Apex could survive without me. It could never survive without him. He'd said it so often that it had become a kind of corporate lore, a story new hires heard on their first day. Ethan had never liked the attention, but he'd taken pride in it, not in the praise, but in the knowledge that his work mattered, that the line he guarded was real. He'd built that gate not for glory, but because he believed the market needed people who said no, even when everyone else wanted to say yes. So when Harold called him into the corner office on a frigid January morning, the sky outside, still pale with early dawn, and said, "Ethan, it's probably time you took a step back and rested," Ethan's first reaction was not anger. It was a strange, floating disorientation, as if the floor had dropped an inch beneath his feet and he hadn't quite caught up with it yet. He'd walked in expecting to discuss the quarterly risk review, to argue about leverage limits on the new credit fund, to do the work he'd done every day for 12 years. He hadn't been prepared for this. For a split second, he wondered if Harold was sick. If something had happened. Then he saw the man standing at Harold's side, and the pieces clicked into place, cold and heavy in his chest. Standing at Harold's side was a man in his early 30s, sharp-suited and slick-haired, with the easy, unearned confidence of someone who had never had to earn anything. Ryan Bennett, Harold's nephew. Fresh off a 3-year stint at a bulge bracket firm on Wall Street, from what Ethan had heard. He opened every other sentence with "back when I was at Goldman," as if those 5 words settled every argument. Ethan had sat through 2 pitch meetings with him already. Both times, Ryan had gotten basic risk metrics wrong. Both times, Harold had laughed it off as youthful energy. Ethan had told himself then that it was harmless. That Harold was just being an indulgent uncle. He'd never guessed the indulgence would cost him his career. Ryan's put in his time in New York, Harold said, leaning back in his leather chair, his tone layered with a strained, performative apology that did little to hide the finality underneath. It's time he came home and helped with the family business. Learn the ropes from the ground up. He paused, as if weighing his words carefully, picking the softest possible phrasing for a very hard decision. As for you, you'll stay on as a formal advisor. Same pay, same benefits, same title on paper. You just don't need to come in every day. Take some time. Travel. See your wife and daughter. You've earned a break. Ethan did not argue. He did not raise his voice, or list his accomplishments, or remind Harold of every fire he had put out over 12 years, every crisis he'd steered them through, every night he'd stayed at the office while his wife put their daughter to bed alone. He did not mention the 2020 freeze, when he'd slept on the office couch for 11 straight days to keep the funds from blowing up. He did not mention every time he'd taken the heat for Harold's riskier calls, shielding him from investor anger while fixing the mess behind the scenes. He simply looked at the man he had followed for more than a decade, the man who had once promised him the chief risk officer's seat for life, and said, "I'll need 2 weeks to hand over my work." Harold had clearly expected pushback. He blinked, then nodded quickly, relief softening the lines around his mouth. "Of course. 2 weeks. Perfect. Take all the time you need. I knew you'd be professional about this." Ethan walked out of that office with his back straight, his face calm. He did not let anyone see his hands shake until he was inside the men's room, locked in a stall, leaning against the cold metal door. He stood there for 5 minutes, breathing slowly, watching his reflection in the stainless steel partition. He felt stupid mostly. Stupid for believing all those speeches. Stupid for thinking 12 years of loyalty and results would matter more than blood. Stupid for being surprised. Over the next 14 days, Ethan did something that caught everyone off guard. He did not check out early. He did not leave half-finished files or undocumented systems or sticky notes with half-remembered passwords. He did not plant mistakes or bury landmines in the code. Instead, he set to work cataloging every last piece of the risk department with the same meticulous rigor he had always brought to his job. Every workflow, every system architecture map, every project file, every underlying algorithm and parameter in the Libra platform. 137 documents. More than 2,400 pages. Organized with obsessive, almost brutal clarity. Every risk threshold annotated. Every edge case explained. Every failure path mapped out in plain language. He worked until 10 o'clock every night, long after the rest of the floor had emptied out, the only sound the hum of the overhead lights and the click of his keyboard. His team watched him, confused at first, then quietly furious on his behalf. Lena Torres, his deputy of 6 years, had said to him on the 10th night, bringing him a cup of coffee and leaning against the edge of his desk, "You don't owe them this. Not after everything. Not after how they did this. You could walk out today and no one could blame you." Ethan had just shaken his head and kept typing, his fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. "It's not about them," he'd said, after a moment. "It's about the work. The system. The people who stay. They deserve to have all the pieces, even if the guy taking over doesn't deserve them." He didn't say the rest. He didn't say that he was also building a record. A perfect, unassailable record of everything the risk team knew, everything they'd warned about, everything they'd recommended. He was building a paper trail so clear, so complete, that when everything fell apart, and he was starting to believe, with cold certainty, that it would, no one could say no one had warned them. No one could say the risks were hidden. They would be right there, in black and white, for anyone to see. When he dropped the leather-bound handover binder on Ryan's desk on his final day, Ryan flipped idly through the first few pages, flicking the corners like he was skimming a magazine, and tossed it aside with a dismissive flick of the wrist. Yeah, I'll get to it. Honestly, though, a lot of this old-school, overcautious stuff probably isn't even how we'll do things going forward. We're moving faster now. We're not going to sit around running 10 different stress tests on every single deal. That's how you miss opportunities." Ethan smiled faintly and said nothing. Inside, he felt nothing at all. He had not built the binder for Ryan. He had built it for the day Ryan would fail, and everyone would ask why no one had warned him. That day was coming. He could feel it in his bones. There was no farewell party, no goodbye dinner, no company-wide email thanking him for 12 years of service. Only a handful of his longest-serving team members gathered silently in his office as he packed his things into a plain cardboard box. Lena Torres, his deputy director of 6 years, had red-rimmed eyes, but held her tears back with rigid discipline, the same discipline he had taught her through market crashes and failed deals and 100 all-nighters. The other 3 stood awkwardly by the door, not knowing what to say. No one had expected this. No one had seen it coming. Ethan clapped her gently on the shoulder. "Keep the standard high. Don't let them erode it. Not even a little bit." She nodded, unable to speak. She bit down on her lower lip so hard Ethan thought she might draw blood. He carried his cardboard box out of the tower he had walked into every day for 12 years. The elevator ride down 47 floors felt longer than any ride he'd ever taken. He passed people he knew in the hallway, and they looked away, embarrassed, not knowing what to say to the man who'd just been pushed out. Some of them had heard the rumors already. Some of them were already currying favor with Ryan. Inside the box, a framed photo of his wife and daughter, taken at their daughter's high school graduation, both of them grinning in caps and gowns, a chipped ceramic mug printed with Apex Capital Risk Department, a gift from the team on his 10th anniversary. 3 dog-eared textbooks on quantitative risk management, their spines cracked from years of use, and a faded Polaroid of the original 7 employees, crammed shoulder to shoulder in that tiny San Francisco apartment, grinning like they had already conquered the world. The January air bit at his cheeks as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the wind sharp enough to make his eyes water. He paused and looked up at the glowing Apex logo set into the glass facade, 50 stories above the street. He remembered 12 years prior, Harold clapping him on the back in that unheated apartment, saying, "Chief Risk Officer. That seat's yours for as long as you want it. No politics. No bullshit. Just you and the numbers." 12 years later, he was just an outsider, pushed aside for blood. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. "Clara Finch. Heard you're a free man," she said, her voice warm and sharp all at once, the same voice he'd heard 100 times in business school libraries, arguing with professors over case studies. "Dinner at the usual spot. My treat. I'm buying the good whiskey. Don't argue with me." Clara had been Ethan's classmate at Wharton. She had possessed a rare, unapologetic ferocity back then, debating professors in lecture halls until the room went quiet, calling out senior partners during her summer internship for burying unfavorable research, walking away from a 6-figure offer at a top investment bank because she'd discovered their research division wrote reports not for investors, but for their investment banking clients to sell deals. She'd never had much patience for the game. She'd only ever cared about being right. Ethan had always admired that about her. He'd never had the courage to walk away from money and prestige just to be right. He'd stayed, and he'd tried to fix things from the inside. He'd been wrong about how much you could fix when the rot started at the top. Eventually, she'd founded her own independent research firm, Insight Risk Advisors. The name was a double pun: sharp, incisive thinking, and risk itself. Her office was in a modest office park outside the city, with fewer than 30 employees and no fancy lobby or marble reception desk. Yet she had carved out a fearsome reputation selling unvarnished, independent analysis to small and mid-sized investors, thriving in the gaps between the Wall Street giants. She'd made enemies, plenty of them. CEOs hated her. PR firms cursed her name. But she'd never backed down. By 8 o'clock that night, they were tucked into a booth at a dim, wood-paneled steakhouse in Brooklyn, a cast-iron pot of braised short ribs simmering between them, the air thick with the smell of smoke and whiskey and caramelized onions. Clara poured 2 fingers of rye into his glass and slid it across the table, her dark eyes studying his face like she was reading a balance sheet, looking for the weak spots. "Go on," she said. "What really happened? Don't sugarcoat it. Don't be polite." Ethan speared a piece of beef, dipped it in horseradish sauce, and chewed slowly. He'd rehearsed the sentence a dozen times on the drive over, but saying it out loud still felt strange. Still felt like it was happening to someone else. Harold put his nephew in my chair. Ryan Bennett? Clara raised an eyebrow and laughed once, a sharp, dry sound. She picked up her glass and swirled the whiskey around, watching the light catch it. Word around the street is all mouth and no follow-through. Thinks a Goldman business card makes him a prophet. Everyone I know says he lasted 3 years in New York because his uncle pulled strings. Got moved out of 3 different departments because he couldn't do the math. Ethan did not reply. He took another bite, stared at the table for a long moment, then said, quietly, "You know Starlight Technologies?" Clara's eyes narrowed immediately. She set her glass down with a soft clink. She leaned forward across the table, all the amusement gone from her face. Of course I know them. The golden child of the renewable energy sector. Solar inverters, storage systems, the whole package. Stocks up 500% in 3 years. Apex is their biggest institutional holder. Everyone's falling over themselves to praise it. I've had 3 different clients ask me if they should buy in. Did you tell them to? I told them I smelled smoke. I couldn't prove anything. The numbers are too clean. The growth is too smooth. Companies don't grow like that without a single misstep. Not in this industry. But I didn't have the data to back it up. Not the good stuff. She paused, watching him. Why? What do you know? Ryan pushed the investment hard. Led the whole deal. I ran due diligence for 6 months. I found at least 5 major red flags. Anonymous overseas customers with no public footprint, ballooning accounts receivable with no corresponding cash inflow, executives dumping shares on a weekly basis through blind trusts, gross margins sliding every quarter even as competitors held steady, and a side indemnity agreement with serious legal holes that could sink the whole company if it ever saw daylight. You told Harold all this? I told him. I wrote a 40-page memo. I presented it to the full investment committee. I walked through every single data point. He said, "It's good to be careful, Ethan. Don't always assume the worst." Then he let Ryan keep pushing it through anyway. Approved the share increase 2 weeks later. Clara was quiet for a few seconds, swirling her whiskey in its glass. She knew exactly what that felt like, to be right and to be ignored, because the truth was inconvenient. She'd quit her first job over exactly that. She knew the taste of it. Bitter. And sharp. Then she lifted her glass. Insight needs a director of research. Small office. Less money than you're used to. Way more work. Way fewer rules. And we will piss off a lot of very powerful people. You in? Ethan looked up at her. He thought about the cardboard box in his trunk. He thought about Ryan tossing his handover binder aside. He thought about 12 years of building something, only to watch it get handed off to someone who would break it. He thought about all the ordinary investors who would lose their savings when the lie finally fell apart. I'd probably bring you a world of trouble, he said. Apex doesn't take well to being crossed. Harold doesn't either. He'll come after you. He'll come after the firm. Trouble? Clara laughed, a short, sharp sound, and raised her glass higher. You think I've stayed out of trouble this long? Having the man who built Apex's entire risk infrastructure walk through my door? This isn't trouble. This is luck. Plain and simple. The market's been waiting for someone to call Starlight's bluff. And you're the only person who knows where all the bodies are buried. Ethan looked at her. Her eyes were bright, hard, unflinching, 2 chips of polished steel. He'd known her for almost 20 years. He'd never known her to lose a fight she decided to win. He lifted his glass. Cheers. For 3 months, Ethan and his small team tore Starlight Technologies apart from top to bottom. Mia Carter, a sharp, methodical data analyst with a background in forensic statistics and a PhD in applied mathematics, ran cross-referencing on every public filing, every earnings call transcript, every supplier and customer disclosure, lining them up against industry benchmarks and peer company performance patterns. She built statistical models to flag anomalies, comparing Starlight's revenue patterns, margin trends, and receivable cycles against every comparable firm in the sector. The anomalies jumped off the screen almost immediately. Their revenue curve is too smooth, she'd said, 2 weeks in, pointing at a chart on her monitor. Real companies have bumps. Bad quarters. Supply chain issues. This looks like someone drew a straight line with a ruler. Owen Reed, a former forensic accountant with 15 years of experience tracing shell companies, followed the money, every wire transfer, every acquisition, every off-balance sheet entity, mapping out ownership structures until his whiteboard was a spiderweb of lines and names. He worked slowly, methodically, following every thread no matter how small. Fraud hides in the layers, he liked to say. You just keep peeling until you hit the person at the center. Jake Morrison, a former investigative reporter with contacts up and down the supply chain and in every port on the West Coast, dug up the stories that never made it into press releases or 10Ks. The quiet whispers from former employees and warehouse workers and freight clerks who knew something didn't add up. He drank a lot of bad coffee in diners at odd hours, listened to people's stories, promised them anonymity, and slowly, piece by piece, built a picture of a company that looked perfect from the outside and was hollow on the inside. They worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. The office kitchen accumulated a mountain of empty coffee cups and takeout containers. The whiteboards filled up, were erased, and filled up again. More than once, Ethan left at 2 a.m. and found Mia still at her desk, eyes red, staring at spreadsheets, her third cup of coffee going cold beside her. He never told her to go home. He knew what it felt like to be chasing a truth that everyone else insisted didn't exist. He knew what it felt like to be the only person who could see the fire and have everyone tell you it's just smoke. The first crack opened with their largest overseas customer. Starlight had booked $8.7 billion in revenue the prior year, 59% of it from international sales. 85% of those international sales came from a single entity, Starlight Energy Holdings Limited, registered in the Cayman Islands. A single customer responsible for nearly half the company's total revenue. And no one had ever seen them. A company buying more than $4 billion worth of hardware a year, Jake said at the team stand-up one Tuesday morning, leaning against the whiteboard, his notebook open in his hand, pages covered in scribbled notes, has no website, no LinkedIn page, no trade show booth with actual employees. Every industry conference they attend, they send different people, no consistent names, no contact info that leads anywhere. I talked to 3 different sales reps from competing firms who've been in this business for 20 years. None of them have ever met anyone from Starlight Energy. None of them have ever seen their product anywhere. They exist on paper. That's it. He paused, tapping the board with his pen. They were incorporated 6 months before Starlight's IPO. And the registered agent? The exact same offshore law firm Starlight used for their public offering. Same address. Same partner of record. Same everything. Classic ghost customer, Ethan said, staring at the company registry printout taped to the board. A glove. Nothing more. It exists on paper only. All that revenue? It's just numbers moving between accounts they control. The room went quiet. They all knew what that meant. This wasn't aggressive accounting. This wasn't a company stretching the truth to hit targets. This was fraud. Plain and simple. On a massive scale. The second break came from customs data, but it didn't come easy. Clara called in a favor from a freight forwarder she'd known for years at the port of Long Beach, a man named Leo who'd been in the business since he was 18. At first he'd said no. He didn't want to get involved. He had a business to run. He didn't want to get sued, or worse. Clara had driven down to meet him in person, at a diner near the port, and sat with him for an hour over pie and coffee. She didn't beg. She just told him what they suspected. Told him how much money ordinary people stood to lose when this all came down. Told him someone had to check. He'd caved in the end. He'd pulled 3 years of Starlight's export records, every container, every bill of lading, every declared value. He sent them over on a USB drive, left in a parking lot, no names, no paper trail. The comparison was staggering. The revenue Starlight reported from sales to Starlight Energy Holdings was 63% higher than the value of goods actually recorded leaving the port. Nearly two-thirds of the product they claimed to sell had never existed on any shipping manifest. They were booking revenue for air, for numbers on a page. For the third that did appear on record, the bill of lading details did not match Starlight's internal records, not vessel names, not voyage numbers, not container seal numbers. Nothing lined up. The containers that did exist were carrying far less and far cheaper components than Starlight claimed to be selling. Some of them were empty. "It's not even clever," Owen said, shaking his head as he stared at the side-by-side spreadsheets, his voice equal parts angry and incredulous. "It's just bold. They assumed no one would ever bother to check. That everyone would just take their word for it. And for 3 years, everyone did." The third break came from a former Starlight senior accountant who reached out through an encrypted tip line after 3 weeks of quiet back and forth. His name was Dan. He'd worked at Starlight for 4 years in the revenue recognition group. At first, he'd just asked questions. Vague, careful questions. Then, slowly, he'd started talking. He agreed to meet Jake only in the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store at 2 in the morning, sitting in the back of Jake's car with the hood up and the lights off. He was nervous, jumpy, kept checking his rearview mirror like someone was following him. He'd signed an NDA. He was scared they'd come after him. Scared he'd never work in the industry again. He told Jake he'd discovered an entire set of customs declarations that had no matching port records, and when he'd brought it to the CFO, he'd been told, "You're very thorough, Dan. But some things aren't your job to worry about. Stay in your lane and you'll go far. Be a team player." "I quit," the man said, his hands folded tight around a paper coffee cup, his hood pulled low over his forehead. "I couldn't sleep at night. I've been an accountant for 22 years. I answer to numbers. And my conscience. I don't want to be part of this when it falls apart. I have kids. I don't want them to grow up thinking their dad helped steal from people." He gave Jake internal spreadsheets, email chains, copies of the altered invoices. Hard evidence. Not just numbers from customs. Proof from inside the building. The investigation went deeper. Over 3 years, Starlight had acquired 7 smaller component and software companies under the banner of vertical integration, with acquisition premiums ranging from 300 to 1,200%, far above market rate for comparable businesses. Owen spent 3 weeks untangling the ownership of those 7 companies, peeling back layer after layer of shell companies and trust structures and nominee shareholders. For of those 7 companies traced back, through layers of shell companies, opaque trust structures, and nominee shareholders, to Victor Dean, Marcus Hale's brother-in-law, a man with no public track record in the renewable energy industry, who'd owned a handful of small car dealerships before suddenly becoming a tech industry tycoon. "Barefaced self-dealing," Owen said, leaning back in his chair, staring at the org chart he'd taped to the wall, lines snaking from shell company to shell company, all leading back to the same name. "They're looting the company right out in the open. Using shareholder money to buy businesses their own families own at absurd markups. And everyone's letting them because the stock keeps going up. No one wants to kill the golden goose, even if the goose is made of paper." Worse was the timing. Every single time Starlight announced an acquisition, Apex Capital had increased its stake in the days before. The earliest buy had come 9 days before the public announcement. The latest, 24 hours. The pattern was too clean, too consistent, to be coincidence. Someone on the inside was tipping them off. Someone was letting them buy the dip before the good news sent the price soaring. "Insider trading," Clara said, when Ethan walked her through the timeline, laying the dates out on the conference room table one by one. Her voice was soft, but each word landed like a hammer on anvil. Not just Starlight. Apex. Harold. Ryan. All of it. They knew. They profited. And they let the fraud keep going because it was making them money. Ethan still needed one final piece. Confirmation from the inside. The internal Apex files that would prove they'd known about the risks and chosen to ignore them. That would prove the timing wasn't an accident. That would tie the whole thing together. He called Lena Torres. It was 9 o'clock at night. He knew she'd still be at the office. She always stayed late. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. "Ethan?" She sounded surprised and wary, like she'd been expecting his call and dreading it. Lena, I need Apex's internal investment files on Starlight. The full due diligence reports, the investment committee minutes, the risk review memos, the approval signatures. Everything you can get your hands on. There was a long silence on the line. He could hear her breathing. He could almost see her, sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen, weighing everything, her career, her loyalty, the 6 years she'd spent building her reputation there, the mortgage on her house, the student loans she was still paying off. Ethan, she said finally, her voice shaking a little, you're asking me to help you take down Apex. You're asking me to betray the company, to break the rules. Yes. Another long, heavy silence. He could almost hear the thoughts racing through her head. He knew how hard this was for her. Apex had given her her first real job. He'd hired her straight out of college. She'd built her whole career there. Then Lena spoke, steady now, the same steady tone he'd heard her use during 100 market panics, when traders were screaming and the screens were flashing red and everyone else was losing their heads. I worked for you for 6 years. You taught me one thing above all else. Risk management isn't about cleaning up the CEO's messes. It's about guarding the line. The line between what's acceptable and what's not. Apex's line has been trampled into the dirt. If I stay quiet now, I'm not just failing this job. I'm failing everything I ever learned. Everything you ever taught me. And I can't do that. I can't look myself in the mirror. It wasn't an easy decision for her. She thought about it for 3 more days. Days where Ryan called her into his office and tried to butter her up, told her she was one of the good ones, hinted at a promotion if she played ball. Days where she watched him ignore every process, override every risk flag, make decisions that made her skin crawl. Days where she lay awake at night, wondering if she was making a mistake, wondering if she was throwing her whole life away. In the end, she decided she'd rather throw her career away than throw her principles away. She collected the files slowly, carefully, a few at a time, so the IT department wouldn't flag her access. She stayed late 3 nights in a row, scanning documents, encrypting them, making sure there was no trail back to her. She was terrified the whole time. Her hands shook when she hit send. 3 days later, an encrypted email arrived in Ethan's inbox, sent from a throwaway address, with no subject line. The files were all there, scanned and timestamped. Every memo, every meeting minute, every signature. Buried in the middle of the packet, he found the original risk memo his own department had written, 6 months before he'd been pushed out. It laid out all 5 major risks in plain language, data-backed and unflinching, and concluded with a clear, unambiguous recommendation, *hold all further share purchases pending full independent due diligence. Do not increase position size, *. At the bottom of the memo, scrawled in blue ink in the margin, handwriting Ethan knew better than his own, was the reply. Noted. Ryan's judgment is sound. Risk is being overly cautious. Proceed with Ryan's plan. H.B. Ethan stared at those words for a very long time. He remembered Harold, all those years ago in that tiny San Francisco apartment, leaning against the whiteboard, the marker still in his hand, saying, "Risk is Apex's lifeline. Nobody, not even me, gets to walk around the risk team. Nobody. That's the rule." The words still felt true in his memory. The ink on the page was still dark. Halfway through the investigation, the pressure started. First, it was small things. A cease and desist letter from Starlight's law firm, threatening to sue Insight for defamation, demanding they stop their baseless harassment. Clara taped it to the office kitchen wall and wrote, "Demand letter number 1" on it in big red marker. "We'll collect them," she said. "Makes good decor." Then it got more personal. Mia started getting anonymous emails at her personal address, telling her to watch her back and mind her own business. Someone drove slowly past her apartment building 3 nights in a row. She told Ethan she was fine, that she wasn't scared, but he noticed she started taking cabs home instead of the subway. Jake got a phone call from an old editor friend, warning him that people with deep pockets were asking questions about him, digging into his past, looking for dirt. "They're trying to discredit you," his friend said. "They're gonna paint you all as greedy short sellers who made up lies to make money." Ethan got a call too, from a number he didn't recognize. A man's voice, low and rough, said, "Walk away from the Starlight Report. Walk away and you'll be fine. Keep going and you'll regret it." He hung up before Ethan could reply. They talked about it in a team meeting the next day. No one suggested stopping. Not even a little bit. "Let them try," Clara said, leaning back in her chair, her eyes sharp. "Let them call us greedy. Let them threaten us. If they're threatening us, it means we're right. It means we're hurting them. And that means we keep going." No one argued. They all knew the stakes. They all knew what would happen if they backed down. The fraud would keep going. More people would lose their money. And the people responsible would get away with it. They kept going. The final report ran to 340 pages. 10 chapters. From the phantom overseas customer to the falsified customs records, from the hollowed-out receivables to the self-dealing acquisitions, from executive insider selling to Apex's coordinated front-running of merger announcements. The evidence chain was seamless, unbreakable, every claim backed by multiple independent sources, every data point cross-referenced against public records. There were no anonymous claims, no unsubstantiated rumors. Only numbers. Only documents. Only proof. Clara sent the draft to 3 respected independent industry experts, 2 former SEC enforcement attorneys, 1 retired chief risk officer from a major asset manager, for anonymous peer review. Their feedback was unanimous, the most thorough, rigorously sourced short research report any of them had read in a decade. One wrote back, "This will change how people look at this sector." And it should. Someone had to do this. The night before publication, Ethan sat alone in the office long after everyone else had gone home. The only light came from his desk lamp and the glow of his monitors. On the desk in front of him lay 2 things: the final, locked PDF of the report, ready to go live at market open, and that faded Polaroid from the early days, the 7 of them squinting into the camera in that tiny apartment. He picked up the photograph and studied it. Harold was young in it, lean-faced, unlined, burning with that unshakable idealistic fire only founders have. Back then they'd had nothing but stubbornness and a stupid amount of faith in each other. They'd believed they were building something different. Something better. Something that played by the rules and still won. Ethan tried to pinpoint the exact day Harold had changed. Was it the first time he'd made the Forbes list? The year Apex's assets under management crossed $100 billion? The afternoon Ryan had walked into the office, fresh off the plane, and filled Harold's head with visions of a sprawling financial empire built on speed and deal-making and swagger, where risk was just something you talked about in press releases. Perhaps it had never been one moment. Perhaps it had seeped in slowly, 1,000 tiny compromises, 1,000 small justifications, until one day the man you'd known was gone and you hadn't even noticed it happening. Just like a company doesn't collapse from one single risk. It collapses from 100 ignored warnings, stacked one on top of another, until finally the whole structure gives way. No single brick is to blame. But every brick that looked the other way shares the fault. He thought about his father. A lifelong accountant. A man who'd never made much money, but who'd never once fudged a number, never once cut a corner. Who'd told Ethan over and over that trust was the only thing that mattered. That once you lost it, you never got it back. Ethan had always thought he'd understood that. Now he was starting to think most people never really understood it until they watched someone throw it away. He scrolled to the final page of the report. At the very end, he had written one line, words his father had spoken on his deathbed, words Ethan had repeated every single day at Apex, words he had taught every new hire in the risk department. Asterisk, the foundation of every market is trust. The foundation of trust is truth. When truth is systematically destroyed, everyone, those who build the lie and those who buy into it, will pay the price. Asterisk. He closed the laptop. Outside the window, the sky over the city was starting to pale at the edges. Dawn was coming. The report went live simultaneously across 3 platforms at 9:30 a.m., right as the opening bell rang. For the first 15 minutes, nothing happened. Then the first sell orders hit. Then more. Then the floodgates opened. 30 minutes later, the first wave of selling hit Starlight Technologies hard enough to trigger a volatility halt. Within an hour, the stock had triggered 3 trading halts and collapsed 20%. $13 billion in market value had vanished before noon. The Nasdaq issued an official statement reviewing the situation. The whole trading floor was talking about it. Every financial news site had it as their top headline. By midday, the SEC announced it was aware of the allegations and would be conducting a formal review. Multiple investment banks rushed to downgrade Starlight to sell or avoid, analysts scrambling to rewrite their notes after months of glowing recommendations. Some of them had had strong buy ratings on the stock less than 24 hours earlier. The whiplash was dizzying. Marcus Hale, Starlight's founder and CEO, posted a statement on X calling the report fabricated and malicious, a coordinated attack by greedy short sellers looking to profit from misinformation. But he waited until after the market closed to release it. It was a surrender, and everyone watching knew it. If he'd had real proof to refute the claims, he would have released it while the market was still open. He would have stopped the bleeding. He didn't. Because he couldn't. Ethan sat at his desk and watched the price tick down, tick down, tick down. The office was quiet. No one cheered. No one high-fived. They all knew what this meant. It meant thousands of ordinary investors would lose money. It meant people would lose their jobs at Starlight, people who'd had no idea what was going on, people who'd just showed up to work every day and did their jobs. It meant a lot of pain for a lot of people who hadn't done anything wrong. But they also knew the alternative was worse. A lie that kept growing until it took even more people down with it. A fraud that got bigger and bigger until the collapse was even more devastating. Pulling the Band-Aid off hurt, but leaving it on would have killed the patient. Ethan's phone lit up, buzzing loudly against his desk. Harold Bennett. He didn't answer. It rang 7 times. Each time, it went to voicemail. After the 7th missed call, a text popped up, sharp and angry. Asterisk Ethan Pierce. What do you think you're doing? Answer your phone. Now, asterisk. Ethan typed 3 words back. Doing my job. The phone rang again, immediately. This time he answered. Ethan. Harold's voice exploded out of the receiver, raw and furious, loud enough that Ethan had to hold the phone away from his ear. Have you lost your mind? Those are internal Apex documents in that report. How did you get them? I will sue you for trade secret theft. I will ruin you. I will make sure you never work in this industry again. Do you hear me? You'll never work again. Harold, Ethan said, his voice even, the same tone he used to calm panicking traders during market crashes, quiet and steady and unshakable. Every allegation in that report is supported by public, verifiable evidence. Customs records, corporate filings, shipping manifests, former employee testimony. The internal documents are just confirmation. They're not the story. The fraud is the story. You should spend less time asking how I got your memos and more time reading what's in them. Especially the parts you wrote with your own hand. The line went dead silent. Ethan could hear Harold breathing, heavy and ragged, on the other end. Like he'd just been punched in the stomach. Do you remember what you used to say? Ethan went on softly. You said risk was Apex's lifeline. That nobody, not even you, got to bypass the risk team. You wrote that down. You said it to every new hire. You stood on stage and told investors it was our competitive advantage. You're not going to tell me you don't remember your own words. Ethan, Harold's voice was smaller now, deflated. All the anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded a lot like fear. You picked your nephew. You signed off on his deals. You threw out my risk warnings. Every single one of those choices was yours. All I did was put the facts in order and show them to the world. I didn't make them up. I just stopped letting you hide them. Harold's voice cracked. What do you want from me? Money? A title? You just want to destroy me? Is that what this is? Revenge? For replacing you? Is it really that petty? Ethan said nothing. He hung up the phone. He sat there for a long time after, staring at the phone on his desk. He wondered if Harold really believed that. If he really thought this was about ego, about being replaced, about hurt feelings. If he really couldn't see that it was about right and wrong, that it was about the thousands of people who'd trusted them and who'd been lied to. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe when you spent long enough at the top, you started to believe everything was personal. That every challenge was an attack. That every truth was just someone trying to get you. When trading resumed after the initial regulatory pause, Starlight fell for 7 straight sessions. Limit down, day after day. From $42 a share to $13. $30 billion in market capitalization turned to smoke. Retail investors posted screenshots of their ruined portfolios online. Analysts issued mea culpas. The whole industry reeled. The SEC opened a formal investigation, then upgraded it to a full enforcement action. Marcus Hale and Victor Dean were subpoenaed to testify. Executive offices were raided. Hard drives were seized. Emails were pulled. Every day, more details came out. Every day, the picture got uglier. Apex Capital's collapse came faster than anyone had predicted. In the immediate aftermath, the damage could have been contained. If Harold had apologized, if he'd acknowledged the mistakes, if he'd cut the Starlight position immediately and brought in independent oversight, he might have weathered it. He was Harold Bennett. He had credibility. He had relationships. People would have given him the benefit of the doubt. But Harold and Ryan made one fatal, predictable mistake. They doubled down. Starlight's fundamentals are intact. Ryan had declared at an all-hands meeting, slamming his fist on the table, red-faced and angry. This is a coordinated attack by short sellers. If we sell now, we're playing right into their hands. It'll bounce back. You'll see. We just have to hold the line. Show strength. Nobody believed him. Not anymore. The internal documents in the short report had laid bare exactly how much Ryan had pushed the Starlight deal, exactly how thoroughly he'd ignored every warning, exactly how little he understood the risks he was taking. The mask was off. Everyone could see the Emperor had no clothes. Institutional investors led the stampede for the exits. 3 large pension funds sent formal letters demanding an emergency investor meeting. Apex's client services lines were overwhelmed. Redemption requests flooded in by the thousands, billions of dollars heading for the door. People didn't just want out of Starlight. They wanted out of Apex entirely. They didn't trust the firm anymore. On an investor call, when asked directly if he bore personal responsibility for the losses and the due diligence failures, Ryan replied, "Cool as you please, markets carry risk." That's the deal. We're all adults here. Let's not play the blame game. No one forced anyone to invest. After the call ended, the portfolio manager who'd asked the question posted one line on LinkedIn, 20 years in this business. I have never met anyone with less self-awareness or less shame. By the end of that day, 3 more institutions had submitted full redemption notices. The run was on. Harold called every contact he had. Old business school classmates. Former partners. Bank CEOs. Industry friends he'd known for decades. People he'd done favors for. People he'd made rich. But the voices on the other end were polite and distant. Asterisk, I wish I could help, Harold, but my hands are tied asterisk, or they didn't pick up at all. When you're on top, everyone wants to be your friend. When you're falling, everyone steps back. No one wants to get hit by the debris. For the first time in his life, Harold Bennett felt real, cold fear. The kind of fear that comes when you suddenly realize everything you built over 20 years, everything you thought was solid and permanent, could dissolve in a matter of weeks. That all those relationships, all that goodwill, all that loyalty, had only ever been as strong as your last quarterly return. The final blow came from regulators. The SEC announced a formal investigation into Apex Capital for insider trading and market manipulation, focused on the Starlight acquisition timeline. Investigators moved into Apex's headquarters and sealed every investment record, every email, every instant message. They interviewed dozens of employees. They dug through years of trading records. The investigation dragged on for 4 months. Month by month, floors of the office emptied out. Employees left by the dozen, carrying cardboard boxes of their own, not knowing if they'd get their final bonuses, not knowing if the company would survive the week. The hallways went from bustling to quiet, then to eerily silent. The coffee stopped being restocked. The plants in the lobby died. Lena Torres was one of the last to stay. She sat through every interview, walked investigators through every instance where Ryan had bypassed formal risk review, every memo ignored, every rule bent, every process shortcut. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't grandstand. She just told the truth, exactly as it had happened. When the investigation concluded, she handed in her resignation. As she walked out of the building for the last time, the Apex logo dim above the front doors, she sent Ethan a message. "I'm free now too." His reply came back immediately. "Welcome aboard." The final penalty was announced on a gray Friday afternoon after the market closed. Apex Capital was hit with a record fine, one of the largest in the industry's history. Multiple flagship funds were ordered to liquidate and return capital to investors. Harold Bennett was referred for criminal prosecution on charges of market manipulation and insider trading and banned from the securities industry for life. Ryan Bennett received the maximum possible fine and a lifetime ban as well. 3 hours before the announcement went public, he'd left the country on a private jet. No one was entirely sure where he'd gone. The empire Harold had spent 20 years building had crumbled to dust in 4 months. 3 weeks after Harold was taken into federal custody, Ethan received a notification from his attorney. Harold's legal team had submitted an official visitor list. There were only 2 names on it, his wife, Margaret, and Ethan Pierce. Ethan thought about saying no. Thought about telling his attorney he didn't want to go. Thought about what good it could possibly do. What there was left to say. In the end, he said yes. He didn't go because he wanted to gloat. He didn't go because he wanted to see Harold suffer. He went because 12 years was a long time. Because once upon a time, they'd been friends. Because some part of him still wanted to understand how it had all gone so wrong. The visit was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon. The detention center sat on the far edge of the city, out past the industrial parks and the highway, a blocky, featureless gray building ringed with razor wire. Ethan drove out there himself, leaving early to beat the traffic. On the way, he passed the old Soma apartment building where Apex had started. It had been renovated into luxury lofts now, with a coffee shop on the ground floor and a valet stand out front. He slowed down for a block, staring at it, and for a second he could almost smell the burnt coffee and the old carpet and the cold winter air leaking through the windows. Then he pressed the gas and kept going. He sat on a cold metal chair on his side of the thick glass partition and waited. The room smelled like disinfectant and old linoleum. A guard stood in the corner, watching, his face blank. The door on the other side opened. Harold walked in. Ethan barely recognized him. His hair was cropped short and shockingly white, like all the color had drained out of it in a matter of weeks. He'd lost at least 20 pounds. His jumpsuit hung loose and empty on his frame, the fabric pooling at his wrists. Deep lines were carved into his face, deeper than Ethan had ever seen them. His eyes were sunken, dark circles under them. He walked in slightly hunched Harold Bennett, who'd once carried himself with the straight-backed posture of a career military officer, who'd stood taller than everyone in every room he walked into, now hunched like an old man. They stared at each other through the glass. Ethan picked up the phone first. Harold hesitated, like he wasn't sure he deserved to, like he was afraid Ethan would hang up before he even spoke, then did the same. "You came," Harold said. His voice was rough and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days, like sandpaper on stone. "I came." Silence settled between them, heavy and thick, broken only by the faint static of the phone line and the distant sound of a guard's radio down the hall. "I had to fight to get you on the list," Harold said finally. He spoke slowly, like each word was an effort. "Because there's only one thing I can't figure out. It's been eating at me. When you left Apex, why did you hand everything over so cleanly? 137 files. 2,400 pages. Every risk flagged. Every process documented, every algorithm explained. You could have half-assed it. You could have left landmines. You could have buried mistakes in the code. You could have made us crash much sooner. Why didn't you? Why make it so easy for us?" Ethan looked at him steadily across the glass. For a long moment he said nothing. He'd thought about this moment 100 times. He'd rehearsed the answer. But now that it was here, it felt simpler than he'd expected. I didn't organize all that to help you. And I didn't organize it to help Ryan. I did it so you would understand exactly why you failed. So there would be no excuses. No way to say you didn't know. No way to say no one warned you. No way to tell yourself you were tricked, or sabotaged, or unlucky. Harold's pupils flared, pinpricks of shock behind the glass. His fingers tightened around the phone until his knuckles blanched white. I handed Ryan 12 years of Apex's risk architecture, every project's weak points, every step of every process, all laid out in black and white, because I knew him. I knew he was arrogant, impatient, convinced he was smarter than everyone who came before him, especially me. The more clearly I laid the answers out in front of him, the less he would bother to look. Because they were my answers. And the one thing he wanted more than anything in the world was to prove he was better than me. To do it his way. Even if his way was wrong. Ethan's voice was quiet, but each word drove home like a nail into softwood. There was no anger in it. No triumph. Only a kind of quiet, unflinching certainty. I didn't leave him any traps. I left him a perfect, flawless, error-free handover. I left him a straight, flat road covered in all the answers he could ever need. And I bet on one thing, that his own pride would make him walk right past all of it. That he would ignore every warning, just to prove he didn't need me. He paused. And he did. You know the rest. Harold's breathing quickened. His hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles blanched white. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked like he was going to be sick. This wasn't a cheap shot. It wasn't sabotage. It was an open plan. I gave him every tool he could have possibly used to succeed. He chose to ignore them. I never broke a single professional ethic. I never falsified a number, never buried a report, never set a trap. All I did was put the truth right in front of him. And then I watched him step around it. Dead silence on the line. Harold's hand was shaking now badly. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. For weeks he'd run through 100 different theories in his head. Ethan was bitter. Ethan was vengeful. Ethan had resented Ryan from the start. Ethan had been planning this for years. He'd been wrong about all of it. The truth was colder, cleaner, more final. And then he understood. Ethan's revenge had never been a conspiracy. It had been an open challenge. He'd handed over a perfect answer key, and in doing so, he'd exposed just how little the new heir knew, just how deep his arrogance ran. Ethan had done nothing wrong. He'd put every possible weapon in their hands, and then watched them use those weapons to cut themselves down. The worst kind of revenge isn't striking someone when they're down. It's handing them a perfect test at the height of their power, and watching them fail even to cheat properly. I lost, Harold whispered. He closed his eyes, and 2 thick tears tracked down his cheeks, cutting paths through the gray stubble on his jaw. I lost everything. The company. The reputation. All of it. All gone. He opened them again, and Ethan saw something there he had never seen before. Not anger, not resentment, not defiance, but raw, unmasked regret, stripped of all pretense, all pride, all performance. But I don't understand. If you could document everything so clearly, if you knew it would go this badly, why didn't you just make me listen? Why didn't you yell or threaten to resign or do something? Why didn't you tell me Ryan wasn't ready? That he would ruin everything? I would have listened to you. If you'd pushed harder, I would have listened. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Harold, I did tell you. I stood in that investment committee meeting for an hour and walked you through every single risk in Starlight. Ryan couldn't answer the most basic questions about customer concentration or cash conversion. You were sitting right there. You heard all of it. You saw all the data. And then you stood up and you said, "Caution is fine, Ethan, but we're going with Ryan's plan." Harold went slack in his chair, as if someone had pulled every last bone out of his body. He stared at Ethan, eyes wide, like he was only just remembering it. Like he'd spent so long telling himself a different story, he'd forgotten what actually happened. You heard every word. Everything I put in that handover file, I said to your face before I ever left. You didn't fail because you didn't know Ryan wasn't good enough. You failed because you chose to pretend you didn't see it. You chose blood over judgment. Family over facts. Blood, Ethan said, very softly. You lost to one thing. Family. You convinced yourself outsiders can't be trusted, that blood will always have your back. But you forgot one thing. Skill doesn't care about blood. And risk doesn't care about it either. It doesn't care who your last name is. It doesn't care how much money you have. It just is. Harold said nothing. Tears ran silently down his face, dripping onto the gray collar of his jumpsuit. He pressed his forehead to the cold glass, his shoulders shaking with silent, shuddering sobs. The proud, unbreakable Harold Bennett reduced to this. After a long minute, he lifted his head. His voice was thick, choked. I did you wrong, he said. I know that. I know I did. You were the best I ever had. And I threw you away. For him. For family. I was stupid. I was greedy. I thought I could have it all. The company. The family legacy. All of it. I thought I was too smart to fail. He paused, swallowing hard. You know, when your dad got sick, back in 14? I made sure you had all the time you needed. Told you not to worry about work. Made sure the bills got taken care of. I thought you'd remember that. I thought you'd owe me. Ethan's jaw tightened. He did remember. He remembered Harold showing up at the hospital, unannounced, with a bag of sandwiches and a stack of magazines. He remembered telling him to take as long as he needed. He'd never forgotten it. He'd always been grateful. I do remember, Ethan said, quietly. I was grateful. I still am. But that doesn't change this. It doesn't make the fraud okay. It doesn't make the lies okay. Gratitude doesn't mean I look the other way while people get robbed. You taught me that once. You said the numbers don't care about favors. They just are. Harold let out a shaky breath. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He just nodded, slowly, like he finally got it. Like he'd known it all along, somewhere deep down, but he'd needed to hear it out loud. Ethan sat and watched him. He'd thought, when this moment finally came, he would feel something like satisfaction. 12 years of loyalty thrown aside for a nephew with a fancy resume. The humiliation of being pushed out like an outdated piece of equipment. The quiet anger of watching his life's work get dismantled by someone who didn't deserve it. He'd thought all that anger and hurt would lift, finally, when he saw Harold broken. But there was no satisfaction. No triumph. No victory. Looking at the old man weeping on the other side of the glass, what rose in him was not triumph. It was something heavier, more complicated. A kind of quiet sadness. He thought of that faded Polaroid, 7 kids packed into a tiny apartment, Harold in the middle with his arms slung over Ethan's shoulder, grinning like they owned the world. Back then they'd had nothing. But back then they'd trusted each other completely. Harold, Ethan said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. My father told me something before he died. He said the worst thing in the world isn't being poor. It's being greedy. We were poor once. We both know there's no shame in starting with nothing. But you forgot that. Greed made you believe only family could be trusted. Greed made you think you could never lose. Greed made you push the one person who always had your back straight onto the other side. He stood up. The metal chair scraped against the linoleum floor. I never set out to destroy you. I just chose my profession. The same day you chose your family. He hung up the phone and turned toward the door. Behind him, there was a dull, heavy thud, the sound of a palm slamming against glass, hard and desperate. Ethan did not look back. Outside the detention center, dusk was falling. The wind had died down, and the distant skyline blurred into soft gray shapes in the fading light. The air was cold, sharp with the promise of more winter. Ethan got into his car but didn't start the engine right away. He sat behind the wheel, staring out at the darkening horizon, his hands loose on the steering wheel. He felt hollow in a way. Not empty exactly. Just finished. Like a long, hard job was finally done. Like he'd closed a chapter he'd been reading for 12 years. His phone rang. Clara. How'd it go? Ethan rested his forehead on the steering wheel and closed his eyes for a long moment. Said what needed to be said. How is he? Old, Ethan said, after a beat. Broken. Looks like he aged 10 years in 3 months. Clara was quiet for a few seconds on the other end of the line. She knew better than to tell him he'd done the right thing. She knew he already knew. She also knew that doing the right thing didn't always make you feel good. Sometimes it just made you feel tired. You know, most people would have caved. Sat there and felt sorry for him. 12 years is a long time. A lot of history. Ethan lifted his head. He stared at the gray building in his rearview mirror, shrinking in the distance. Clara, am I too hard on people? Clara laughed, a short, warm sound, the kind of laugh that meant she thought the question was ridiculous, but she'd answer it anyway. You're not hard. You're just clear. I knew it the day you walked through my door. You didn't come here for revenge. You came here to clean things up. Tear out what's rotten and then keep going. That's who you are. Always has been. And the world needs more people like that, not fewer. Ethan turned the key in the ignition. The engine purred to life. He glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The detention center grew smaller and smaller behind him, shrinking to a gray dot, until it vanished entirely into the dark. He pressed his foot to the gas and drove toward the glowing sprawl of the city. Afterwards, Starlight Technologies was delisted from the exchange 6 months later. Marcus Hale and Victor Dean were convicted on multiple counts of securities fraud and sent to federal prison. Apex Capital was broken up and sold off in pieces, its funds transferred to other managers, its office floors subleased to younger companies, a 20-year legacy reduced to footnotes in court filings and case studies in business school ethics classes. Harold Bennett's sentencing memo was published on the Department of Justice website, 2 decades at the top of Wall Street, condensed into 3,000 words of dry legal prose. He got 8 years. As for Ryan, some said he'd fled to Southeast Asia, running a small, unregulated fund out of Singapore, scamming wealthy expats who didn't know his history. Others said South America. No one knew for sure, and no one particularly cared. The last time his name appeared in public record was at the bottom of the SEC's lifetime bar order, printed in small black letters, just another name on a long list of people who'd thought they were too smart to get caught. Insight Risk Advisors moved into a new office building just off the financial district, bigger, brighter, with a proper conference room and a view of the river. The team grew from 5 people to more than 100, becoming one of the most respected independent research firms in the industry. They didn't chase the biggest clients. They didn't cut corners. They just told the truth. It turned out there was a lot of demand for that. More than anyone had expected. Lena Torres opened her own risk consulting practice in Denver, Torres Risk Advisory, specializing in building risk frameworks for small and mid-sized businesses, the kind of companies that couldn't afford huge internal risk departments. She hired a small team, mostly young women just starting out in the field, and taught them the same things Ethan had taught her. Guard the line. Don't look the other way. The numbers don't lie. In an email to Ethan, sent after her first year in business, she wrote, "Big companies have regulators watching them. Small companies have nothing. No one's checking. No one's guarding the line. They're the real foundation of this economy. If the foundation is solid, everything on top stays standing. That's what you taught me. I'm just passing it on, asterisk." Ethan forwarded the email to Clara. He added one line at the top, "Our net keeps getting wider." Clara wrote back 10 minutes later, asterisk, "Not wide enough. Never will be, asterisk." One late weekend afternoon, Clara walked past Ethan's office with a mug of coffee and found him standing by the bookshelf, staring at the old Polaroid, now framed and hung on the wall beside his father's military portrait. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, leaning in the doorway. Ethan didn't turn around. He kept looking at the photograph, the 7 young faces grinning back at him from another lifetime. "I was wondering if I could go back to that winter, that tiny apartment with the broken heater. The day he clapped me on the shoulder and said the chief risk officer job was mine forever. If I knew then how it would all end, would I still say yes? Would you?" Ethan was quiet for a very long time. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky pink and orange over the river. The light slanted through the window, gilding the edges of the photograph. Yes, he said finally, his voice quiet but completely sure. Because it was never about him. It was about the work. About doing the thing I'm supposed to do. Who I'm doing it with doesn't change that. The work is still worth doing. The line is still worth guarding. Even if some people choose to step over it. Clara stepped forward and picked up the chipped Apex Risk mug from his desk, turning it over in her hands. Fine cracks spiderwebbed across the printed lettering, the glaze worn thin from years of use. She'd seen it on his desk every day since he'd started. She'd always wondered why he kept it. You still keep this? I keep it. Not for Apex. Not for Harold. For the version of Harold that actually believed risk was a lifeline. For the version that meant it. It's good to remember that people start somewhere. That they don't start out broken. That the line between good and bad isn't a wall. It's a slope. And you have to watch every step. Clara set the mug back down gently, right where it had been. Ethan? Harold was right about one thing. One thing anyway. Yeah, he said you were the person he trusted most. He never earned that trust. Not in the end. But you never once broke it. Not even when he gave you every reason to. Not even when he betrayed yours. That's the part he'll never understand. But it's the part that matters. Ethan said nothing. He took the Polaroid out of its frame, just for a second, and flipped it over. Faded blue ink ran along the white border, scrawled in Harold's old handwriting, *Apex founding crew. Winter 2009. We're gonna change the world, *. He smiled, a little sadly, and slipped it back into the frame. He hung it back on the wall, straightening it carefully. Outside, the sky had gone dark. The city lights had come on, stretching for miles in every direction. The great machine of the market never slept. Tides rose and fell. Empires were built and empires fell. New frauds popped up every day. New liars stepped into the spotlight. And Ethan Pierce sat at his desk, bent over spreadsheets and risk models, quiet and steady as a nail driven into wood, holding together the quiet, unglamorous, essential joint of the whole vast mechanism. He guarded the line. In the name of risk. In the name of truth. A notification popped up in the corner of his screen. An alert from Lighthouse, their new risk monitoring platform, the successor to Libra. Built better, stronger, more vigilant than ever. A red flag. An anomaly. A company whose numbers were too clean, whose growth was too smooth, whose story sounded too good to be true. Mia's voice carried down the hallway, bright and sharp, already excited, already focused. Ethan. The system flagged a new anomaly. We've got another one. Ethan pushed his glasses up his nose and opened the alert. On the screen, an unfamiliar company name glowed beside a flashing red risk score. Another one. Another story. Another line that needed guarding. He set down his coffee cup and started typing. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten. The city was waking up. The market was waking up. And Ethan Pierce went back to work, mending the net that would never be finished.